Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We will begin the webinar in 1 minute. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a second with the program, but I wanted to take a moment and let you know a little bit about how the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance is growing stronger in 2021. The Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance is evolving to a better, more efficient approach in support of state industry and individual manufacturers. Our new plan still involves the familiar manufacturing extension agents, MEAs, around the state, but they're now complemented by regional business consultants, RBCs, and manufacturing specialists with detailed expertise. One of the ways we want to share that detailed expertise is through these webinars. This webinar is just a brief overview of what can be a much more detailed assistance offered by the Manufacturing Alliance. Of course, we still rely heavily on our network of sponsors and partners. Many of those partners have capabilities and services that complement our goal of making your business more successful. We certainly cannot do it alone, and we have many of our sponsors and educational partners on this call today. So thank you to all of those who are joining us. Also, our team of trusted advisors is now prepared to evaluate companies holistically by assessing, diagnosing, and optimizing operations. If you'd like more information about this assessment process, which is currently subsidized by grants, and so there is no charge to the company, give us a call or drop us an email. And remember, MEAs are still accessible, and traditional services like problem solving, business connections, and engineering work remain available for manufacturers in all 77 counties. We are still there when you need us. And now on to our webinar. Today's event is the second webinar in our three-part supply chain management series. If you missed the intro to this series or the first webinar, Fundamentals of Supply Chain Management, recordings can be found on our website, www.okalliance.com. These webinars will be delivered today, pre-recorded by supply chain expert Jem Fleming. Throughout these webinars, our supply chain expert here in Oklahoma, Dr. Rajesh Krishnamurthy, will be live and answering your questions as they arrive during the webinar. Rajesh is an engineer and manufacturing specialist with the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance and has over 2 decades industry experience. Please utilize the chat function during this presentation to ask any questions, and we will also have Q&A with Dr. Krishnamurthy afterwards.
Brought to you by the Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance, along in partnership with Business Excellence Group. I'll be your host today, Jem Fleming. For the next 30 to 45 minutes, we will be going over the proficiency level of supply chain management. In the first workshop, we covered the fundamentals. We looked at the building blocks and how they make sense across the global supply chain. In this particular workshop, we're going to start looking for the interconnectedness and interdependencies between those building blocks, helping us figure out how do we make them how do we make the connections between them, and how do we optimize the entire supply chain through data analysis, through stakeholder engagement, and through some other models that will help you move forward throughout your career. The learning objectives for this 8-hour workshop, if it's in a face-to-face, or depending if it's in a virtual environment, it may be broken up into multiple smaller sections. But at the end, you're going to be walking away with enough information to gain approximately 8 continuing education hours. Things we're going to be covering is the magnitude of supply chain and how it impacts the world. You're going to see a set of statistics that really show just how big it is, but also some of the challenges that all companies are faced with. That'll lead us into how do we begin to plan our success through strategies, not only from our strategic planning as a company, but down into the supply chain elements around sales and operation planning. How do we connect the end state customer requirements into our internal requirements, and then making sure that our suppliers are able to meet the objectives and can come up with a cohesive plan. We'll talk through inventory strategies. There are multiple ways to deal with inventory, and some of them are very inefficient. Others are very effective. We'll talk through some of the top strategies that you can consider depending on how you want to connect your S&OP process and how it aligns to your internal business processes. We'll cover elements that deal with managing the profile of suppliers relative to cost strategies or price strategies. And you'll see there are multiple ways that you could go about optimizing your workforce, each of them having a different set of assumptions that drive you down a different path. Sometimes you'll be dealing with a mental model of price analysis. Other times and other suppliers, it makes sense to go after a cost analysis. Value creation at the point of use. One of the things that you start to see is as we implement a supply chain, we have to improve the supply chain. And through the improvement, our end state goal is not just to create work, but it is to increase value. And through the point of use, engaging internal stakeholders, suppliers, supply management, we can find ways and techniques to basically help each other drive for improvement. We'll talk through logistics, and this is both forward logistics and reverse logistics. What are some of the driving factors that come about? We'll talk through the emerging practice of third-party logistics and what is the value behind it and what are some of the trends going forward. And then last but not least, we're going to start looking at some of the advanced technologies that are either in play today or are in development and coming. And the thing that we'll talk about, you may be a small startup company and you say, I don't have a lot of technology. I think one of the things that you're going to see is you have access to more technology than you may realize. And you're going to see how it starts to impact everything that you're doing in your world, and then set the stage for you to take your company to the next level. Through this workshop, as we cover these different learning objectives, we'll also be allowing you to reflect on how do you apply this back at work? How do you use it real time? And the concept of action learning will be implemented throughout this session. And that basically means we will spend time at the beginning of the workshop having you reflect on a product line that you're dealing with back at work, a set of challenges, maybe with certain suppliers, or overarching goals for your organization going forward. And as you reflect on that, our goal then is to help you walk through each of these sections, make those connections to the models, theories, and concepts back into your work at hand. And we will break you up into some different sessions with your peers, either small group or larger group. And the intent here is to work together, talk through how might you apply what you just learned into a situation that's at hand. And through that interaction in peer network, you will start to see that they will provide ideas. You'll gain insight from them and vice versa. You'll also be able to gain some feedback. You have some ideas, maybe bounce it off them. It's in a somewhat of a safe environment. They can help you craft a way to bring it back into your company. And the other thing that we will provide is that there's a series of templates that will help you not only learn the techniques in class, but also allow you to walk or go back to work and walk an organization through filling out some of these templates to gain alignment. So these are really intended to be applicable tool sets that will not only bring you forward, but bring everybody in the organization forward. With that, we will continue to step through the various portions of this class and give you a sample around what you're going to be exposed to. At the end, we will provide an opportunity to ask questions to gain more clarity. As in the foundational class, we are going to use a model that is going to be aligned to this particular course. And the model is originally derived out of what was known as the SCORE model. And it was a reference model for a supply chain that was developed by the Supply Chain Council and later acquired by the APICS organization. The model is a very thorough methodology of looking across an entire supply chain. And one of the things that we're going to do here is, just from a simplistic standpoint, we're going to kind of adapt those concepts just to give a framework to talk about the different elements. So as we go through the workshop, we'll spend time talking about what does it mean to be in the center? What is the core reason that we need to have a solid supply chain? What are some of the driving factors? What are things we need to be taking into account? From there, once we gain some clarity, we can start stepping out into the outer portion of this model. We'll start from the planning phase. We'll talk through what does it look like to plan a supply chain in your organization and outside of your organization. We'll go in a clockwise direction, which will then lead us into, okay, we're going to be talking about sourcing. When we source, we are going to have to think about optimizing the limited resources that we have. And we will show you some techniques that look at the type of supplier that you're working with or the particular portion of a supply chain, and then determine how do we apply some either cost concepts and models or some price concepts and models. And each one of them have a relevant component that allow you to not just waste time, but really zero in on what's the most important. And each one of the cost and the price have their place depending on the degree of risk and the value into an organization. We'll go into the make section. And this gets into a little bit of that point of use. What are some of the tools that we can apply inside of the environment that help us drive a higher degree of innovation, help us leverage the suppliers or the customers into walking through and improving the output? We'll get into the next portions around not only the deliver, but the return. And as we talked in the fundamentals, the concept of a reverse logistics or return has really grown over the past 5 or 10 years. There is an expectation that the forward delivery mechanism and the reverse mechanism for returns, for whatever reason, that both of them are extremely efficient and easy to use from a stakeholder or customer standpoint. And we will see that companies that have implemented elegant solutions are seeing success. You see other companies that have said, well, it really isn't that important, and their customer base starts to look for other alternatives. So we will talk through what are things that we should take into account, and how do we figure out, how do we make sure that our organization is leveraging the best outcome possible. And then we'll talk a little bit more into the final portion, and that's the enabling. How do we leverage additional competencies and insight to truly grow the supply chain management network? And in this case, we'll be looking at the technology overlay and see where you can use it, where you might be using it, and how does it expand going forward. So this model will be highlighted through each of the sections from the start of the workshop through the end. And so that way you can kind of get a sense of how does it all fit together. If you've ever had an opportunity to work with the SCORE model, you probably understand the simplicity and the transparency that is created out of that. You have the very clear insight to what do you do internally, and then how do you perform interactions with your suppliers and their suppliers. And then you use the same model looking downstream into your customers and then your customers' customers. So you can look at the entire supply chain and make the best decisions. As this talks on the right-hand side, multiple variables that go into a supply chain. And what we need to do is figure out, how do we understand those variables? How do we gain data and insight to those variables? And then how do we come up with a solution that optimizes those variables? We talked about the degree of interdependencies. There is not a single one of these boxes that stands on its own. Each and every one of them have the connectiveness to make sure that the entire system is solving the problems. And last, you'll find that these tools are very applicable whether you are producing goods or producing services. And this is something that is often talked about, how similar are the supply chains and how different are they? And we'll explore some of these throughout this seminar and help you figure out what is the best approach for you. One of the things we want to do is put it in perspective. Who needs a supply chain? Who needs to have it managed? Well, today, everybody on this planet is involved with supply chain in some form or function. Whether we are buying food, buying clothing, buying housing, buying transportation, we are part of a supply chain whether we realize it or not. And that's the thing I think we can kind of step back and personally reflect around. How are the complexities of our own supply chain impacting us as individuals? So who has the best deal? Where do you go to make sure that you can try something out? Do you do it online? Do you do it going into a block and mortar store or brick and mortar store? How do you find the best prices? How do you know if the supplier is going to be around for 5 years if they give you a lifetime warranty? All of these things are impacting everybody on the planet. And everything that is being manufactured or produced is impacting and being utilized by these billions of people. The other thing that stands out is the growth of our population is actually in an exponential rate. So if you were to go through and take some of this data set and pull it out and put it into an Excel chart, one of the things that you're going to see is that where we're at today in the year 2020, we are on a very steep up curve relative to where we were at in 1990, and that stretches back into where we were at in 1950 and 1900. Now, fast forward we're gaining about 1 billion people on this planet every 10 to 12 years. And so when you see that steep curve on the rate at which we're acquiring people that need goods and services, the challenges continue to grow. And within that population of individuals, countries are now in a phase of development. They are gone from a lot of countries that were third and second world countries are now second and first world countries. They have economic buying power. So we need to make sure that our supply chains are adapting to the demands of the entire population, and the population buying power continues to grow. And the other thing that we start to see is that the supply chains continue to emerge. So because of our population growth, some things that we're dealing with, healthcare, people are living longer. So we are having supply chains around healthcare, within, maybe assisted living, memory living, drugs, all kinds of different things that continue to support an aging population. The other thing is technology is gaining pace with across the entire globe. So at one point in time, the ability to communicate via telephone was limited to individuals in the world that had an infrastructure for landlines. And that was very few countries relative to the total population. Where are we today? Think about the smartphone capability. You don't have to have that same infrastructure in order to have the communication capability. And so you start to see that the moving forward with the cell towers and satellites, that the ability to communicate and connect individuals has grown very fast. We see that in the country itself, or in the world itself, about 450 million people work in supply chain companies. Huge. In the United States alone, there's about 45 million. One of the things we have to take into account is making sure that the individuals that are working in those companies have a skill set to figure out how do you keep up with all of this growth. Not 45 million people in the US are supply chain people, but they work for supply chain companies. They produce things such as General Motors, Apple, taking a look at General Electric. These are large corporations that produce goods and services for the general population. That 45 million comprises that. The subset of how many supply chain folks, about 1.5% of the population inside of the companies is actually aligned to supply chain. Global economies. There's a lot of times people start to ask, why do we need to worry about things outside of our own country? When you stop and step back and look at the scale of what is happening, it's enormous. We start to see that, while the US at one point in time was the largest economy in the world, one of the things that has happened in the last decade alone, we've had a country, China, that has gone from being not so much of a powerhouse into being number one from a global world economy. And in the lower chart, you see that they're the number one manufacturing facility in the world from a revenue generated. And the revenue here is generated in trillions of dollars. So the GDPs are reflective around where there is demand, where there is a need for a solid supply chain, and where can we fit into it? What are some of the factors that are going to be at play? Challenges to companies. With that previous chart, some of the things that we see is, companies, the lifespan is no longer what it once was. So back in the 1950s and the 60s, on average, companies were in business for about 60 years. We look today, on average, they have a lifespan of about 20 years. Many reasons for that. Some of it is they didn't keep up with the times. They didn't have a product or service that kept up with the times. They were acquired by another company. So there are a number of things happening. And what we want to do is just make sure that when we're dealing with supply chain, some of the most successful companies that are around today are really starting to figure out it's not just creating products and services, it's about being able to supply them. And so having that supply chain becomes a competitive advantage to help companies stick around a much longer period of time. Globalization. Many factors continue to play out in this, where we are having challenges to continue to think about moving things offshore. And this really did start in the 1970s and 1980s, the 1990s, when globalization really took off. And there was a huge drive around companies that were very heavily dependent on labor needed to somehow work forward to figure out how do you shift this. And so instead of a high labor world or country, companies started looking for low cost geographies. And you started to see them in the Asian basin. So in the 70s, you saw a lot of manufacturing facilities for automobiles move over to Japan. We have seen since then the expansion and movement over into China, into Taiwan, into Vietnam. We've seen things move into South America, Latin America. And so there's, a lot of driving forces. There's also at times, in order to be able to sell a product in a company or in a country, you have to make it in that country. And so see, these are some of the variables that are playing out. You have to have presence if you want to grow in a market. Now, there is recently been a lot more focus around how do we reshore or nearshore? What are some of the driving factors there? Anytime you are offshore and you're further away from where you're manufacturing or producing, there is a higher degree of complexity, which drives a higher risk factor. So risk is becoming a big item to take into account. And we have to think about if you are bringing your sources closer to home, then you have less variables that can actually impact things. And so your risk factor goes down. The second thing is we have administration that is now putting an emphasis. So the government is saying, we want to rethink about reshoring, and they're making it attractive to try to do it. And the third thing, technology is expanding to allow the affordability of bringing things back here into your local economy. So we're leveraging more advanced technology that is actually driving the cost down further than low-cost geographies from a labor standpoint. That is some of the driving factors from a supply chain you have to take into account. Innovation. This is a chart very telling that we look at the amount of patents that are generated in different countries. I've only picked two, and one of the things you start to see is there's an exponential rate here from the 1950s up into the year 2020. The two countries we're looking at are the United States in red and China in blue. Look at the amount of patents that have been generated in that period of time. And the things, the column on the left-hand axis is in millions. So we're dealing with today about 10 million patents have been generated here in the United States. China, significantly more. Now, all kinds of speculation around how real is that? Are they duplicates? That isn't the point. The point is we have countries that are driving innovation. They are coming up with new opportunities and solutions in order to grow and support the economy. One of the things that you start to find in these innovation or these patents, a lot of them are aligned to technology. So technology is advancing in order to not only provide the products and services that we're going to create, but to leverage them in the way we actually manufacture them or produce them. And this gets into what we can do in tapping into those innovations from a supply chain to make sure that we're optimizing and accelerating the advancements. And one of the things we continue to talk about in supply chain is it has to become a competitive advantage. Corporations are now seeing the value and demanding this more and more. One of the things you see here is generally the old-fashioned way of doing business was a tactical focus. You needed something, you went to purchasing, they put together a purchase order, they reached out, got 3 quotes, the lowest quote got the purchase order. All we did is create a tactical approach. Today, there is a need to drive a strategic focus. And the strategic focus is you don't just generate and shuffle paper. You think about all of the competitive issues going on in the market. You think about what kind of sources are out there, what technology is out there, what's the market demand, how do we make sure that we're optimizing inventory, how do we make sure that we're dealing with mitigating risks across the entire supply chain. So while both of these automobiles will get you from point A to point B, one will do it very agile. They will do it very nimble. And we need to make sure that we are going to continue to focus on creating that strategic focus. Some of the challenges that come out of dealing with supply chain, and the chief procurement officers, there's a conference that's put on by CAPS Research on a routine basis. And one of the things that they do is they bring in the executives from multiple companies and they meet for a couple days and just talk about what's emerging, what's evolving. And then they summarize what are the main themes that are coming out of this. And a couple things really stand out here that we need to be taking into account. Chief procurement officers, what keeps them up at night? Risk management. Think about the whole pandemic issue where we've just gone through with COVID, the cybersecurity challenges that are occurring. These are impacting supply chains. Suppliers are going out of business because cash flow issues and the pandemic had such an impact. Cybersecurity, people are working from home. They're more apt to have their infrastructure breached. Digital transformation, how do we make sure that we keep up with the rate of change going forward? Gaining a seat at the table. This one is how do we make sure that the value that we bring is viewed as strategic and value added by your executive staff, your operations staff, your engineering staff. So we need to drive that strategic focus and value add in order to make sure that we remain in meeting the needs of what the organization is asking for. And then one of the last things is the whole talent acquisition and management. Companies are looking for strategic, capable individuals in supply chain. There's a huge demand for them, and the best companies or the biggest companies are having difficulty maintaining the best talent. So you're gaining insight to this talent and this knowledge and skills in this workshop. They're going to help you move forward in your personal career in addition to helping your corporation. So this is what executives worry about when it comes into supply chain. You will be exposed to different methodologies and tools to help move through each and every one of these so you can be successful. When we go to the outer circle and we start talking about planning, one of the things that we need to do is think about what is the demand of the product lines that are out there. And this refers into sales and operations planning. How do we start to look at the different product lines that we're dealing with? What phases of their life cycle are they in? Are they ramping? Are they ramping down? Are they in a research and development? And so let's look at the year 2022. You have a supply chain organization that theoretically would be working with product A, green, that is in a end of life cycle. Product B is going into a growth cycle. And product C is probably dealing still in a research and development. 3 products require 3 unique strategies in order to make sure the supply chain is ready to meet the needs. And that one of the things of when we plan, we start to get insight around what is the forecast from our customer base, and then how do we internally structure the supply chain to make sure that we're meeting those needs? How do we work with the suppliers? How do we work with the logistics companies? How do we stock things in a warehouse? How do we manufacture the best way or the product line that is needed in each and every one of these? So that's the value that you will get out of the planning phase and dealing with the S&OP methodology. We'll be talking a little bit about inventory ordering processes. So once I have my plan and I bring materials on site, how do I make sure that I'm dealing with them the best way? Do I just order millions of everything just in case? And finance and executive staff generally say no. Then how do I make sure that I'm getting the right amount? And when they're here, do I treat everything equally? And the answer to that is no. When they are here, certain items will have higher priority than others. We'll talk through the ABC inventory analysis. When we look at how do we make sure that we have the right amount from a cycle stock. So in a given period of time, how much do we use? And that becomes the cycle. How quickly can we replenish it? How quickly can the PO be put through, the supplier deliver, and meet our needs? How much safety stock do we have to have? And each and every one of these get into a set of strategies that allow us to make sure that we have the right amount of inventory. Not too much because it costs too much, and not too little because we don't want the production line going down. So these strategies will be discussed. We'll also start thinking about the sourcing portion of that model. And this gets into when we interact with suppliers. Will be discussed. We'll also start thinking about the sourcing portion of that model. And this gets into when we interact with suppliers, there's a concept called supplier segmentation. And it's referred to from a Kraljic matrix, which came out from the McKinsey company, the consulting firm, that allows us to look at the type of supplier that we're dealing with as in a 2x2 quadrant. And while it's not completely visible here, the 2 axes are on the lower x-axis, we need to consider how much spend or value with the supplier. And on the y-axis, we need to think about what's the risk within that supply base or the complexity. And so between the risk and the value, we start looking at different ways of determining which suppliers fall into which quadrants, and then what strategies do we apply working with them. And it just gives you an opportunity to think about with all the hundreds, if not thousands of suppliers you're dealing with, you don't treat each and every one of them the same. You need to work with certain ones of them strategic, a much more hands-on business alignment strategy to ensure that you're going to be successful. A routine, I don't need to do that much with them. And so we need to find ways to automate this or set up something that is far less hands-on. And that's what we will be doing in this section. When we go into the make, we're going to be talking about concepts around how do we think about innovation and improvement. We'll be looking at models that explore how much value is driven over a period of time. And 2 models we'll consider is you have your standard exploit or continuous improvement curve, and or you have your exploration or innovation curve. And one thing that you start to see here is that you have an exponential rate when you go into innovation on value as time goes on. And that's where the green goes into the ramp up. And what we'll do is have you think about and deal with each and every one of these in their unique way. We'll have you consider, how do you leverage your suppliers in engaging in what's known as early supplier innovation? How do you work with concepts around value engineering and value analysis in order to optimize that? So you're moving beyond just the continuous improvement red line, and we're really focusing on driving innovation, coming up with new ideas and new solutions into that, exploring what can happen to drive more value. When we think about the deliver and return, one thing that we'll be talking about is third-party logistics. For years, up through the 1980s and 1990s, most companies manage their own logistics. They own their own trucks, they own their own warehouses, they own their own employee base to manage the warehouses. And one of the things that we started to find is that we had smaller companies at the time form themselves, and they referred to as third-party logistics. They grew exponentially. And what they brought is the ability to invest in technologies that were advancing the logistics. And a lot of companies, while it was important, it was also very difficult for them to invest their own money to keep up with the advanced technologies. So when you go out to a third-party logistics company, they'll do that for you. They'll also manage some of the variability that you don't have to deal with. The dealing with the logistics issues of import tax, export tax, making sure that I'm going from multimodal, from shipping to train into trucking. They'll manage those things for us. And we don't have to, as a company, hire people to do that for us. And the last thing, they bring the expertise, they bring the focus and the value in that, where a lot of companies have always treated this portion as kind of a second rate type of skill that they needed to fund. And unfortunately, too many companies since, put a lot of energy into the products that they created, but didn't think about, well, it's not that important, we're just shipping it out. We're just driving it into some inventory. We really don't need technology. And what we're finding is the best companies are now investing in the entire supply chain. And to do this, there are a number of companies out there in third-party logistics that can truly optimize solutions for you, and they're affordable. Reverse logistics. We see today, this is a model where basically when you ship something back, there is more complexity in this supply chain than people realize. So you don't just pick it up and bring it back. You have to have inspection processes. You have to have sorting processes. And in today's world, there are companies that actually can take items that are used, they can sell it into a secondary market. Now, you can do that, or you have to make the decision, do I resource it and scrap it? Do I recycle it? Do I send it back to the supplier? How do I make sure that I'm dealing with all of the cash flow from the customer to our company back into the supplier? And it becomes very complex. Think of Amazon. Amazon today has probably one of the more solid programs in this area. And it's, you have people that are making decisions to shop through Amazon because it has a great return process. You don't have to worry about it. And generally your cash is back in your bank within 24 hours. So this is where third-party logistics and reverse logistics can become a competitive advantage for your company. Technology. We'll talk to just a brief few of these things, but as we go forward, we have to think of ways to integrate our processes inside of our company. And an ERP, or enterprise resource planning, is a way to take all of these components we've been talking about and manage it through a system. So we'll talk about that. Now, you as a smaller company may not have an ERP system. You need to consider, what are your planning systems and how do you automate them? But in time, you're finding that there are these ERP systems or general planning systems that are becoming very affordable, that allow you to connect everything together. Your production workforce, your human resources, technology, planning, all of these things, finance, come together where data is managed and stored and solutions exist. We deal with Internet of Things, IoT. Today, there are 26 billion different connected devices in the world, between cameras, sensors. All of these things are giving us visibility and transparency into different portions of our supply chain. And you're seeing companies like, again, Amazon, FedEx, DHL, that are leveraging this. And they're truly starting to get a full level of transparency into your supply chain. Wherever the product is or a material, they have the ability to manage it and give you insight. And then artificial intelligence. This is an emerging environment to say that we're working to have computers create the same level of sophistication that a human being does, not only in the way they look at data, but the way they analyze it and the way they come up with theories going forward. People at times say, well, artificial intelligence, I don't really use that, that's too advanced, my company doesn't need to deal with that. A smartphone, in the way it does search algorithms and connects data, that is an early form of artificial intelligence, but it is a form of artificial intelligence. You start to see these order sites when you get onto the internet, and it brings up information that's relevant to what your desire is. Those are patterns that exist of artificial intelligence today that we can really start to tap into and use them, plus expand out into other solutions. You have artificial intelligence systems today, software, that manage risk. They watch where suppliers are in the world. They see what variables are impacting them, and they'll come up with alternative paths. So technology is growing. And with the amount of patents we were showing at the beginning of the workshop, and the bulk of them being aligned to technology, that's where there is a future of supply chain that is only going to become more sophisticated, more automated, driving a higher degree of visibility, transparency, and control. So that's going to be key going forward. And in summary, we really take a look at supply chain is enormous in the world, and there's a huge drive for it. We start to think about forecasting. It's very complex trying to understand what a customer wants. And then how do you make sure that everybody in your supply chain is informed, and informed as often as a change? One thing they talk about, every forecast comes out is usually incorrect the moment it is put in place. It's going to be changing. So we need to make sure that we understand and have planning systems in place that can deal with that degree of variability. We're going to think about and continue to manage cost and price and do it in appropriate manners. We talked about driving innovation at the point of use from an improvement standpoint. How do we leverage the innovation and knowledge of our suppliers? Or how do we bring subject matter experts into the way we're doing business today to drive new solutions? We talked about logistics and materials management relative to third-party logistics. And it's growing, and it continues to grow. And so that is the thing that we have to, again, figure out, how do we tap into it? And then big technology, it's a game changer. Everything that's going on in the world is aligned to some form of advanced technology. And we have to make sure that we can adapt, create the environment where we aren't afraid of it. We we nurture what's there, and we seek what is coming. When we pull these things together, we are going to take a supply chain and make it an excellent competitive advantage. And that's what you can do coming out of a workshop like this. So with that, we're going to stop. We're going to allow some questions and answers to help you gain more insight to this particular workshop, Proficiency in Supply Chain Management. With that, I would say good luck and thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Are there any questions following our webinar today? Please feel free to use the Q&A portion or the chat portion of the Zoom call. All righty, seeing no questions, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this is just a snapshot of a much more detailed assistance that can be provided by Oklahoma Manufacturing Alliance. So if you want more information on supply chain and how we can assist, please don't hesitate to reach out by email or a call. Working with our partners and taking advantage of everyone's capabilities will make sure to get you connected and get you the right resources at the right time to be successful. Together, we'll grow your business and grow Oklahoma. Again, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Our third and final webinar in the series will be on March 4th at 10 a.m. And again, if you've missed any of the other webinars in this series, please don't hesitate to go over to our website, okalliance.com, where you can view all of our previous webinar recordings. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.